the Temple of Solomon, a masterpiece not only of architecture, but of faith and vision. How did Solomon turn his father David's dream into reality? And what does the temple truly symbolize for the people of Israel? In this episode, we uncover the story behind the construction of one of the greatest wonders in history. I am Solomon, king of Israel, a man blessed with wisdom and wealth beyond measure. Yet one task was set before me that surpassed all else, a sacred task that could not be claimed as mine alone. It was to build a house for the Lord, where his presence would dwell among his people. This was not simply a structure of stone and wood. No, this was the fulfillment of a promise, a dream my father David carried in his heart but could not complete. It was now my responsibility, my honor, to turn that dream into reality. When my father spoke of the temple, his voice was filled with longing and reverence. He said, "Solomon, the Lord has chosen you to build his house. Not I, but you. This is not just for our people. It is for the glory of God." As I listened to him, a strange mix of pride and trepidation welled up within me. How could I, a man, hope to construct a dwelling worthy of the Creator of the heavens and the earth? How could mere gold, cedar, and stone capture his majesty? But it was not just about the materials or the grandeur. This temple would stand as a testament to our faith, obedience, and covenant with the Almighty. I knew the weight of the responsibility I carried. Building the temple would require more than skill or resources. It would require faith, trust, and the cooperation of an entire nation. It was a task that would demand my all, and yet it was not a task I could refuse. And so I began. I prayed, I planned, and I prepared, knowing that this would not just be a house for God. It would be a symbol of his presence among his people.
My father David was a man of war and worship, a king whose hands were calloused from wielding swords and whose heart was softened by the songs he played on his harp. He had conquered kingdoms, brought peace to Israel, and united our people under one God. Yet for all his victories, one dream remained beyond his reach, a dream as sacred as it was impossible. My father longed to build a house for the Lord, a place where the presence of God could dwell among us. I remember the day he shared that burden with me. The palace gardens were quiet, save for the soft murmur of wind through the olive branches. We sat beneath one of those ancient trees, its roots deep and twisted as though they held secrets of 1,000 years. My father's face, always so resolute, was softer that day, etched with lines that spoke fighting and praying. He looked beyond the horizon, his gaze as distant as the mountains in the north. "Solomon," he said, his voice low but steady, as if he were entrusting me with a sacred treasure. "There is something you must know." He fell silent for a moment, and I watched as he searched for the right words. "I long to build a house for the Lord, a dwelling worthy of his glory, a place where his name would rest forever." But God spoke to me through his prophet Nathan and said, "David, you are a man of war. Your hands have shed blood, and for that reason you will not build my house. But your son, he will accomplish it." He turned to look at me then, and for the first time I saw something I had never seen before. A glimmer of sorrow in his eyes, not from defeat, but from understanding the limits placed on even the greatest of men. His hand, calloused from years of battle, reached out and rested firmly on my shoulder. Though his grip was strong, it was not harsh. It felt like a mantle being passed, heavy and sacred. "This is your task, Solomon," he said. "It is not for kings or nations, but for him, the Lord, the God of Israel. Build it with care, build it with love, and build it so that all who enter will know that God's presence dwells there." The weight of his words settled on me like a stone. At that moment, I was no longer a boy. I felt the full gravity of what he had passed on to me. My father had fought wars and carried burdens I would never fully understand, yet this task, this temple, had eluded even him. How could I, a young man untested by war and unscarred by life, complete what David himself could not? I sat silently beneath the olive tree, listening as the wind stirred the leaves above us. I thought of what the temple would mean, a place for God to dwell, a symbol of our covenant, a promise fulfilled. And yet, I also felt a stirring of fear. How could any house, no matter how grand or glorious, be worthy of the God who held the heavens in his hands? What wood, what gold, what stone could ever contain his majesty? My father must have seen the doubt in my eyes, for he spoke again, softer this time. You will not build it alone. The Lord will guide you. He will give you the wisdom and the strength to fulfill his command. Trust in him, my son, and you will see it done. There was no arguing with him, no way to refuse what had already been decided by the Almighty. I looked into his eyes, eyes that had seen both the horrors of war and the beauty of God's promises fulfilled. His faith became my faith, and his dream became my duty. That day under the olive tree, I realized something profound. I would no longer live only for myself. My life, my reign would be shaped by this promise. The temple was not a monument to kings or nations. It was a covenant between God and his people, and I, Solomon, would be its builder, whether I felt ready. I rose with my father, my heart both heavy and determined. As we walked back toward the palace, the golden light of the afternoon filtered through the branches, casting shadows that danced on the ground before us. My father's footsteps were steady, his shoulders straight, as though the burden had lifted now that it was shared. Mine, however, had only just begun. From that moment on, the temple became a part of me. I would see it in my dreams. Cedar walls rising to the heavens, gold shimmering in the light, and the name of the Lord echoing in its halls. The task was immense, and I knew it would demand everything I had, perhaps more. Yet I vowed to see it through, not for my glory or my father's, but for the Lord, who had chosen me for this purpose. And so I became not only a son, but a keeper of promises, a bearer of dreams, and the servant of the Most High. The task was immense, far beyond the scale of anything our people had built before. To craft a house for the Almighty was to defy what hands could accomplish. Yet, I knew it must be done. The temple would not only honor God, but remind our people of his covenant with us, a physical manifestation of the unseen, a place where heaven would meet the earth. The first step was gathering materials, and I knew no effort could be spared. I sat late into the night, surrounded by maps, scrolls, and lists of what would be needed. Cedar from Lebanon, quarried stones from our land, precious metals, fine linen, and the labor of men willing to dedicate years of their lives to something greater than themselves. I wrote to Hiram, king of Tyre, my father's trusted ally and friend, requesting his aid. "The Lord has given me peace," I wrote, "and now I will fulfill the promise made to my father David. Send me cedar and cypress from your great forests, for there is no wood so fine as yours. Send me your skilled workers, men who can cut timber and craft with precision." Hiram's reply came swiftly, and with it, a blessing. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has given David such a son to carry out his will. I will send you all that you need, the cedar, the craftsmen, and the labor of men who know the weight of sacred work." And so the forests of Lebanon stirred under the axes of skilled woodcutters, their strikes echoing through the mountains. Massive cedar trees fell, their trunks larger than a man's outstretched arms. The scent of the freshly cut wood drifted on the wind, carried down the slopes like an offering. From there, the logs were bound together and floated down rivers to the ports, where they were loaded onto ships bound for Joppa. The sea carried them, creaking beneath their weight, and when they reached the shores, caravans of oxen and carts took up the journey, inching across the sun-baked earth toward Jerusalem. From the quarries came stone, white limestone hewn from the depths of the earth. I had commanded that no hammer, chisel, or tool of iron should be heard on the temple grounds. Each stone was cut and shaped in the quarries, where the air rang with the sounds of labor. Sparks flew as iron struck stone. The dust choked the air, settling on the backs of men who worked tirelessly, carving each block to perfection. The roads leading to Jerusalem became arteries of life. Long lines of oxen, creaking carts, and laborers stretched into the distance. The noise of movement, voices shouting, wheels groaning, animals braying, became a familiar hum, an anthem of effort. Yet amidst the chaos, there was no grumbling. These men were not merely workers, they were servants of God. Each knew that their hands were part of something eternal. I saw it in their eyes, a glint of purpose, a spark of pride. I sent out a decree to all of Israel, summoning tens of thousands to take part in the construction. 70,000 men carried heavy loads, 80,000 toiled in the quarries. Over 3,000 supervised the work. It was a sight to behold, an entire nation drawn together, unified in labor and devotion. From morning until dusk, the land seemed alive with industry. The clang of tools on stone, the creak of ropes straining under their loads, and the calls of workers echoed across the hills of Jerusalem. As I walked among them, I saw their efforts, the sweat that darkened their garments, the calluses that roughened their hands, and the way their backs bent under heavy beams. "Your work will not be forgotten," I told them, my voice raised so all could hear. "You do not build for me, nor yourselves. You build for the Lord." Those words brought a quiet resolve to their faces, and they worked on, their steps steadier, their shoulders a little straighter. At night, as the sun bled into the horizon and the shadows lengthened, I would stand on the hillside overlooking the city. Fires burned across the camps where laborers rested, their quiet voices drifting on the wind. The temple was not yet built, but I could feel its presence. It was as though the earth itself understood the holiness of the task and lent its strength to the men who toiled upon it. Yet there were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that the task was too great. What if the stones crumbled under their own weight? What if the wood splintered or the gold tarnished? How could any work of mortal hands be worthy of the eternal? I would close my eyes and recall my father's voice, steady and strong. "It is not for you to build perfection, Solomon. It is for you to build in obedience. The Lord will bless what you give." And so we gave. We gave our time, our sweat, and our faith. We gave from the earth, its stone, its wood, its treasures, and from our hearts, believing that even the work of mortal hands could please the Infinite One. When the foundation was laid, the work truly began. What rose before us was more than a building, it was an act of worship, carved in stone and crafted in gold. Every day the temple took shape, not in chaos, but in the quiet reverence that only sacred labor could inspire. The limestone blocks, hewn from the earth's depths, arrived from the quarries fully shaped, each one cut to exacting precision. I had decreed that no sound of hammer or chisel would be heard within the temple site itself. This place was holy, and the work upon it should reflect its sanctity. And so, in the silence of Jerusalem's hills, the stones were fitted together, rising in perfect unity. Each stone, though massive, fits seamlessly into the next, as though they had always belonged together. The workers moved with purpose, their hands calloused and rough, yet gentle as they placed each piece. I watched them often, men whose faces were streaked with sweat, their brows furrowed in focus. They moved as though their work was a prayer, each motion precise, each step deliberate. To them, this was not merely labor, but a service to God Himself. 5 minutes later, the forward people picked up the pieces, all 4 of us mouth-mouthed. The towering columns of cedar wood were brought forward next. Felled in the forests of Lebanon, these trees had once reached for the heavens, and now they would stand upright again, this time as part of the dwelling place of the Almighty. The wood was polished to a smoothness that caught the light, glowing with the warmth of life still lingering within it. The scent of cedar filled the air, sweet and clean, carried on the breeze through the hills. It felt as though the very land knew the purpose of this temple and offered its finest treasures willingly. Inside, the walls began to rise. The carvings were nothing short of magnificent. Cherubim with outstretched wings, palms that seemed to sway, and open flowers blooming as if touched by sunlight. No detail was left to chance. Every stroke of the craftsman's tool was deliberate, a silent hymn etched into wood and stone. I would often walk through these unfinished halls, my footsteps softened by the layer of sawdust on the floor. I would run my hands along the carvings, marveling at the care and devotion that went into every line and curve. This, I would whisper to myself, is worthy of him. When the time came to overlay the interior with gold, the temple glowed as if lit from within. I spared nothing. Every inch of the Holy of Holies was lined with the purest gold, polished until it shone like the sun. The beams, the carvings, and even the floor shimmered with light. It was said that when the sunlight struck the temple at dawn, it could be seen from miles away, a beacon on the hill, as though the glory of the Lord had descended to rest upon it. And yet, for all its grandeur, there was no arrogance in the work. This was not for me, nor for the pride of Israel, but for the God who had chosen us. The craftsmen knew this, and so they worked with humility. I spoke to them often, offering my thanks. Your hands, I told them, are building more than walls. You are building a legacy of faith, a place where our children's children will come to meet the Lord. The days turned to weeks, the weeks into years. From sunrise to sunset, the temple site buzzed with life. The clang of tools echoed across the hills, punctuated by the creak of carts and the calls of laborers guiding the oxen. Fires burned in the distance, where metals were melted and shaped into vessels, altars, and ornaments. At night, when the work paused, the hills stood quiet under the stars, a silhouette of what was to come. I would stand there, often alone, watching the structure rise, feeling the weight of the task, and yet finding peace in the progress we made. But there were challenges too. At times the work slowed, the hands of men wearied by the strain. I could see it in their faces, the lines etched deeper, the steps less sure. Some murmured of the years slipping by, of families waiting in far-off towns. I understood their burden, for it was mine too. And so, I called the workers together one evening as the sun sank behind the hills. Standing before them, I spoke not as a king, but as a fellow servant of God. You are not building for a man, I said, my voice steady and clear. You are building for the Lord of all creation. This temple is not just stone and gold. It is a promise that God's presence will dwell among us, that we are His people, and He is our God. What you do here will echo for generations, long after our names are forgotten. Let that truth give you strength, for this work is eternal. The murmurs quieted. I saw shoulders straighten, weariness replaced with resolve. From that day, they worked not for wages or kings, but for the God whose glory would fill the temple. The Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would rest, was the last to be completed. The moment I walked into that chamber, I was overcome. It was a small room, yet it held the weight of eternity. Its walls, lined with gold, seemed alive in the flickering light of the lamps. Two great cherubim, carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold, spread their wings over the chamber, their presence both majestic and humbling. This was the place where heaven would meet the earth, where the unseen would be made visible. In those quiet moments, as I stood in the chamber alone, I prayed. I prayed for wisdom to see this work through, for strength to carry its weight, and for humility to remember that none of it was mine. Lord, I whispered, let this house be worthy of your name. After 7 long years of labor, the temple stood complete. It rose above Jerusalem like a crown, shimmering with a brilliance that seemed almost otherworldly. Its towering columns of cedar, polished and adorned, reached for the heavens. The golden walls caught the light of the sun, reflecting it so brightly that those who approached had to shield their eyes. The city, which had grown used to the sounds of tools and laborers, now stood silent in awe. It was as if all of Israel had held its breath in reverence. I stood at a distance, gazing upon it as the wind carried the scent of cedar and stone, scents that had filled the air for years as the temple took shape. Now it was complete, and though I had seen every step of its construction, I could scarcely believe it. 7 years had passed, years in which the temple rose as a labor of love and obedience. To see it now, fully realized, was to feel a weight lifted, though another weight, a greater one, remained. The day of dedication dawned like no other. From every corner of the kingdom the people came, streaming toward Jerusalem in endless throngs. Men, women, and children arrived carrying gifts: grain, oil, lambs, and oxen, offerings for the Lord. I watched from the palace balcony as the roads filled, their dusty paths alive with the feet of the faithful. Some sang as they walked, their voices carried on the breeze. Others wept, overwhelmed by the significance of this day. They came not as individuals, but as one people, drawn together by a promise that now stood fulfilled. The priests moved with solemn purpose, their robes shimmering white as they carried the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. The Ark, which held the stone tablets of the law, was the heart of our covenant with God. I watched them carry it with care, their steps deliberate, as though each pace forward brought them closer to heaven itself. The people fell silent as the priests approached the temple doors, a hush so deep that even the wind seemed to pause. As the priests entered the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, where none but the high priest would go, the air changed. A cloud descended, thick and radiant, filling the temple with the undeniable presence of the Lord. It began slowly, a mist curling through the golden chamber, growing until the light of the lamps was obscured. Outside, the people cried out, some falling to their knees, others lifting their hands in awe. It was as though God Himself had leaned close, blessing the work of our hands and resting His presence among us. I stood before the altar, the weight of the moment pressing upon me. My robes, fine and embroidered, felt insignificant compared to the grandeur of the day. Raising my hands to the heavens, I began to pray, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. It had been the theme for 3 years, and the sound sensitive to it now. O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you, in heaven above or on the earth below. You keep your covenant of love with your servants who walk before you with all their hearts. Now, Lord, let your eyes be open to this house day and night, this place where you have chosen to put your name. May your ears hear the prayers your people offer in this temple. The words poured from me, born not from memorization but from the depth of my heart. I prayed for the people gathered before me, for the future of Israel, for the strangers who would come seeking God's face, and for forgiveness when we fell short. When we sin and turn back to you, I said, hear our cries. When famine strikes, when war comes, when the heavens close and the rains cease, may this temple be a place where mercy flows. As I spoke, I could feel the presence of God all around me, something far greater than the gold, the cedar, or the stone. It filled the air, wrapped around the people, and settled deep within my spirit. When I finished, a great silence followed. The people stood still, as though they were waiting for the heavens to respond. And then the moment came. Fire! It fell from the heavens, a blazing column that struck the altar and consumed the sacrifices in an instant. The crowd gasped as the flames roared, bright and fierce, yet strangely without smoke. The priests fell face down, overwhelmed by the glory of the Lord, and then, like the breaking of a dam, the people erupted into worship. Trumpets blared, harps played, of awe, of devotion. The Lord is good, they cried. His love endures forever. The sound was like the rushing of mighty waters, filling every corner of Jerusalem, echoing through its streets and out into the hills. I stood among them, no longer just a king but a servant, one voice among thousands, lifted in praise. My eyes burned with tears, for in that moment heaven and earth had met. The promise had been fulfilled. The sacrifices continued into the night. Oxen and sheep were offered in numbers beyond counting. Fires blazed across the temple courts, their light painting the faces of the worshippers who danced and sang as though they could not contain their joy. I watched as fathers lifted their children to see the temple shining in the darkness, its gold catching the firelight, its columns casting shadows that stretched far into the city. For them, this temple was not just a building, it was a sign that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob dwelled among his people. And as the night deepened, I slipped away to a quiet corner of the temple grounds. I leaned against one of the massive stone walls and looked up at the sky. The stars, countless and brilliant, seemed closer than ever before, as if they too were drawn to this place. I thought of my father, David, of his longing to see this day. I could almost hear his voice carried on the wind, whispering, "Well done, my son." Yet, as I stood there, a realization settled over me. This temple, for all its grandeur, was not eternal. The gold would one day tarnish, the cedar would wither, and the stones would crumble. Its true power was not in its beauty, but in its purpose, a place for men to meet with God. It would not be the walls that carried our faith forward, but the hearts of those who worshipped within them. I glanced up at the buildings, its origins unclear, but the heart of those who worshipped within them. I whispered a final prayer into the night. Lord, may your presence never leave this place, and may your people always seek your face. The firelight flickered, the voices of the people echoing faintly in the distance. I turned and walked back toward the altar, the temple towering above me, as unshakable as the promise it represented. And though the temple was now complete, I knew the work of faith was only beginning. As the night of the dedication faded and the fires of sacrifice dimmed, I remained alone in the temple courts. The noise of celebration had subsided into a quiet hum, distant now, as the people returned to their homes. The air was thick with the lingering scent of burning offerings, smoke and ash, mingled with the sweet aroma of incense. Above me, the stars glittered like 1,000 unspoken promises, silent witnesses to the covenant renewed that day. I stood in the shadow of the temple, its massive walls rising behind me, golden even in the faint light of the moon. My body ached with weariness, the weight of the years pressing on me, yet my heart swelled with something deeper, something unnameable. Pride? No, not pride. It was gratitude, reverence, and perhaps the faint whisper of relief. The work was done. 7 years of labor, thousands of hands, countless sacrifices. It all led to this. The temple was complete, and God's presence had filled it. But as I looked upon its grandeur, I felt a quiet voice stirring within me, soft but persistent. This too will pass. M.A.F. The realization was sobering. For all the beauty of the temple, the cedar that had once towered in the forests of Lebanon, the gold pulled from the depths of the earth, the stone carved with care and precision, none of it would last forever. Time would wear it down. The wood would crack, the gold would tarnish, the stones, though massive, would one day crumble. This temple, magnificent as it was, would not endure beyond the hearts of those who worshipped within it. I walked to the edge of the altar, the place where the fire had fallen from heaven, where God had accepted our offerings and our prayers. The stones beneath my feet were warm, as though they still held the touch of that holy fire. I knelt there, my hands resting on the earth, and I prayed, not the grand prayer of dedication that the people had heard earlier, but a quiet prayer, one meant only for the ears of the Almighty. Lord, you have kept your promise, you have made your dwelling among us. But let it not be these stones or these walls alone that hold your presence. Dwell also in the hearts of your people, for if we turn from you, no temple, no matter how beautiful, can save us. But if we walk in your ways, you will dwell with us forever. The wind carried my words away into the night, and for a long moment I knelt in silence. I thought of my father, David. This had been his dream, his unfinished work, the burden he had carried and passed on to me. I wondered what he might say if he could see the temple now. Would he weep with joy? Would he kneel beside me in prayer? Or would he too remind me of what I now knew, that the true temple was not built with human hands, but in the hearts of men who sought after God? I rose to my feet and turned to face the temple once more. The two great cherubim in the Holy of Holies, their wings outstretched over the Ark of the Covenant, seemed to watch me, silent and unblinking. There, in the innermost chamber, the very presence of God had descended like a cloud, thick and radiant. And yet, it was not the gold or the carvings that gave the temple its holiness. It was God Himself, choosing to dwell among us. As the wind stirred the night air, I thought of the generations to come, of sons and daughters who would one day walk these same courts, offering their prayers and sacrifices, seeking the face of the Almighty. Would they remember the covenant? Would they honor the promises we renewed this day? Or would they forget, as men so often do? I imagined fathers telling their children the story of this temple, how it had been built, how fire had fallen from heaven, how God's presence had filled it like a cloud. "This is where the Lord dwells," they would say, pointing to the walls that shone like the sun. But I wondered, would they also teach their children the truth? Would they remind them that a building is only a symbol, that the true temple is the one built within? I lifted my face to the sky, to the endless expanse above me, where the stars continued their silent vigil. I could almost hear the question whispered by the heavens themselves. "Solomon, what will you build now?" Well, it was a question for all of us, I realized. This temple, though magnificent, was not the end. It was only the beginning. For what good is a house for God if His people do not live in His ways? What use are golden walls and carved cherubim if the hearts of men grow cold? I turned to the temple one final time, its majesty humbling me. It stood as a monument to faith, unity, and obedience. Yet its power did not come from its beauty or its size. Its power came from the covenant it represented, from the God who had chosen to dwell there, and from the people who had labored with their hands and hearts to see it built. And as I walked away, I whispered one final prayer. "Lord, let this temple stand as long as we stand with you. May it remind us of your mercy, of your faithfulness, and of the promises you have made. But when the time comes, if we turn from you, may we remember that you dwell not in walls of stone, but in the hearts of those who seek you." The fires of the temple burned behind me, their lights stretching into the darkness. The smoke rose high into the night, carrying our prayers to the heavens. For the first time in years, I felt a deep peace settle within me. The work was done, and the temple was complete. But the greater work, that of building faith, of leading a people, of ensuring that the temple lived on in their hearts, that work had only just begun. When the temple stood complete, it rose above Jerusalem like a golden promise, gleaming in the sun and whispering of heaven's presence on earth. Yet as I looked upon its beauty, I knew this: no structure, no matter how grand, could contain the Almighty. The temple was a covenant, a symbol of God's faithfulness and devotion. It stood as a reminder that worship is not about walls or altars, but about the condition of our hearts. I addressed the people, my voice steady. This house we have built is not for God alone. It is for us, to remember Him, to seek Him, and to humble ourselves before Him. But if our hearts stray, this temple will be no more than stone. So I ask you, what are you building in your life? Is it for yourself, or is it for something greater? For the most sacred places are not made of gold or cedar. They are built within, where God's presence truly dwells.
The temple is complete, but Solomon's journey doesn't end here. What happens when his wisdom extends beyond Israel's borders, attracting attention from faraway lands? Stay tuned for the next episode to discover the fascinating meeting between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Don't forget to like, share this video, and tell us your thoughts about the temple in the comments below. Subscribe to never miss the next episode.